Welcome to the Podkey summary of Scotland in the late Middle Ages. This stretch of late medieval Scottish history is really about how a kingdom gets made, tested, and remade under pressure. You've got wars with England, powerful nobles, who were sometimes half partners and half problems, a country split by geography and language, and a crown trying to turn all of that into something more cohesive. By the time you get to Flodden in 1513, Scotland has built a strong sense of identity and some impressive institutions, but it's still vulnerable in ways that feel very human. Succession crises, bad bets, and the limits of power. The starting gun was a dynastic mess. After Alexander III died, and then Margaret, the Maid of Norway, died too, Scotland was left with 14 claimants to the throne, which gave Edward of England the opening he wanted. He stepped in as arbiter, picked John Balliol, and made that choice come with recognition that Scotland was a feudal dependency of England. So the problem wasn't just who wore the crown, it was that English power was now being used to hollow out Scottish sovereignty from the inside before the invasion of 1296 made it brutally obvious. What followed wasn't one clean uprising that settled everything in a single glorious moment. William Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge mattered, Robert Bruce's coronation mattered, Bannockburn definitely mattered, but independence came through sustained resistance over years of war, shifting fortunes, and a lot of blood. And one of the most striking political statements to come out of that struggle was the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. It appealed to the Pope to recognize Scottish sovereignty, and it argued that a king's legitimacy depended on defending the independence of the community. That's a big idea for the time, and it's one reason the document has had such a long afterlife in discussions of national identity. Even after independence was recognized in 1328 by the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, the crown still had to make the kingdom governable. The Stuart monarchs spent generations pulling semi-independent lordships closer to royal control through forfeitures, appointments, and by backing loyal families like the Campbells and Gordons. A major step came in the 1490s when James IV suppressed the MacDonald lordship of the Isles, which had long been a power center of its own. But royal authority in Scotland was never as deeply rooted or as well-oiled as in England. There wasn't the same intrusive bureaucracy or regular taxation, and repeated royal minorities meant regents and magnates kept getting chances to dominate politics. So behind the story of a strengthening crown, there's also a story of murders, faction fights, and civil conflict around kings, like James II, James III, and James IV. Parliament grew into a body representing the three estates, clergy, nobility, and burghs, with a real role in taxation, justice, war, and legislation. Still, its influence rose and fell with the balance of power. Once James IV was governing confidently after 1494, he could push Parliament to the side pretty effectively. Scotland's map shaped its politics in a very direct way. The central lowlands were fertile, better connected, and more urban, which made them easier to govern through more conventional institutions. The highlands and the southern uplands were poorer, rougher, and harder for kings to reach, which meant they could also shelter resistance. Language tracked that divide too. Scottish Gaelic remained dominant north of the Tay, while Middle Scots became the language of government, the ruling elite, and national literature in the lowlands. That helped create a shared state culture, but it also widened the cultural gap, because lowland writers increasingly treated Gaelic as rustic or backward. And then there's the clan system, which is often imagined as one giant family tree with swords. In reality, it mixed kinship, feudal obligation, and military leadership. And many ordinary clan members weren't actually related to their chiefs. Clan identity was social and political as much as biological. The economy put hard limits on what Scottish rulers could do. Before the Black Death reached Scotland in 1349, the population may have been just under 1 million. By the start of the 16th century, it may have been closer to half that. That kind of demographic shock leaves marks everywhere. Abandoned land, lower incomes, and an economy reshaped for generations. Scotland also had much less good farmland than England, only about a fifth to a sixth as much arable or quality pastoral land. So a lot of the country relied on marginal pastoral farming, fishing, and local production, with poor roads and difficult terrain limiting internal trade. That meant many communities had very little cushion when harvests went bad. Exports were mostly raw materials: wool, hides, salt, fish, animals, and coal. Wool later declined after sheepscab and trouble in the Low Countries market, while hides and salmon held up better. Meanwhile, Scotland regularly had to import essentials like wood, iron, and grain, along with luxury goods for people who liked to live well while everyone else worried about the weather. The military system was changing too. Scotland used a mix of levies of able-bodied freemen, feudal service, and later money contracts to retain professional men-at-arms and archers. Its famous schiltrons, those dense infantry formations, could stop cavalry as they did at Bannockburn, but they were less effective when facing arrows and artillery. James IV leaned hard into military modernization. He built a strong artillery arm, set up a foundry in 1511, and even used cannon successfully to take Norham Castle. He also pushed naval ambition to a remarkable level with the Great Michael, launched in 1511, around 240 feet long, roughly 1,000 tons, carrying 24 cannon, and reportedly the largest ship in Europe at the time. It's one of those details that sounds almost mythic, and then you remember someone had to pay for it. But all that grandeur didn't save Scotland at Flodden in 1513. Because of the Auld alliance with France, James renewed the alliance and invaded England, after England joined the Papal Holy League against France. At Flodden, Scotland's 18 heavy guns needed 400 oxen to move and proved much less effective than the English artillery, which had better range and mobility. The result was catastrophic. The king died, many nobles died, and huge numbers of troops died with them. It triggered yet another royal minority and showed the strategic trap Scotland lived with. Its French alliance could pull it into war with England, even when domestic stability pointed the other way. What's easy to miss in all the warfare is that late medieval Scotland was also building institutions and culture. Religion wasn't simply decaying. Some monastic houses contracted, but mendicant friars expanded in burghs, and new devotions like the Five Wounds, the Holy Blood, and the Holy Name of Jesus met changing urban spiritual needs. The crown also gained real influence over church appointments after the Papal Schism, and by James IV's reign that could look pretty brazen, as when his illegitimate son Alexander became Archbishop of St. Andrews at age 11. Efficient for royal control, not exactly a poster for clean governance. Education widened beyond clerical training into administration and elite culture. The Education Act of 1496 required the sons of barons and substantial freeholders to attend grammar school, and universities were founded at St. Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen. At the same time, Middle Scots became the language of government and literature, helping shape a distinct national voice. You see that in John Barber's Bruce, in the stories of Wallace, in the poetry of the Makars, and in Gavin Douglas's 1513 Aeneadus, the first complete translation of a major classical work into an Anglian language. Royal patronage tied Scotland into the wider Renaissance too, through imported Flemish art, continental musicians, and palaces like Stirling, Linlithgow, Holyrood, and Falkland, where European styles were adapted to local materials and tastes. And all of this fed national identity alongside war. The Declaration of Arbroath, the legends of Bruce and Wallace, and symbols like the St. Andrew's Cross, which soldiers were required to wear by 1385. So Scottish identity wasn't built only by resisting England. It was also built by stories, institutions, language, art, and repeated efforts to imagine a shared political community. That's the through line here. Scotland became more coherent and more self-aware, but never fully insulated from geography, noble power, disease, or the risk of dynastic politics. It's a history full of dramatic battles, sure, but also of slower changes that matter just as much in government, language, education, and culture. And maybe that's the most interesting part. Kingdoms are never only won on the battlefield. They're also argued into being, administered into being, and occasionally hauled into being by 400 oxen. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.
King.